She married a stranger to save her family, only to find out he owned the whole mountain. Seraphine Vane was 23 years old, and every morning looked the same. Cold dirt under her nails. A ribbon barely holding her hair together. And behind the thin walls of her father's cabin, a cough that never seemed to stop. Her father had spent years chasing gold that never came. What he found instead was debt. Letters from the bank sat stacked in a tin box by his bed, and every one of them said the same thing in a different way: pay up, or lose everything. Seraphine's little brother and sister didn't know any of this yet. They still ran barefoot across the rocks outside, laughing like the world was soft and safe. Seraphine wanted to keep it that way for as long as she could. But that night, sitting by a dying fire mending a shirt that had already been mended twice, her father finally said the thing he'd been avoiding for weeks. He couldn't work the claim anymore. His lungs wouldn't let him. And the bank wasn't going to wait for his lungs to get better. He told her she needed to marry someone strong. Someone steady. Someone who could carry what he no longer could. His voice shook when he said it. But he didn't take it back. Seraphine kept her hands busy with the needle so he wouldn't see them shake too. She didn't want to be handed off like a debt gets handed off. She wanted to choose her own life, even just once. But when she looked at her father, really looked at him, saw the fear behind his eyes, she couldn't argue. Not that night. Later, alone at the table with a candle burned down to a stub, she opened an old borrowed book. Stories of cities she'd never seen, trains that could take you anywhere. For a few minutes, the cabin didn't feel so small. She imagined being more than just a sick man's daughter at the end of a dirt road. Then someone knocked. It wasn't a nervous knock. It was steady. Like the person on the other side already knew exactly why he was there. Her father grabbed the old rifle and opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man with frost caught in his beard and moonlight resting on his shoulders. Tall. Broad. Wrapped in a coat that had clearly seen 100 winters. He said his name was Callan Hale. He held land higher up in the mountains, and word had reached him about the family's troubles. He wasn't rich, he said. But he had strong hands and steady work. And if Seraphine agreed to marry him, he'd pay off what was owed in town and make sure her family had enough food and firewood to survive the winter. He didn't dress it up. No charm, no sweet talk. Just plain words, spoken slow. The room went silent. Her brother and sister peeked down from the loft with wide eyes. Her father leaned hard against the table, coughing into his sleeve. When her father asked Callan what he really wanted out of this, Callan didn't flinch. He said he needed a partner, not a decoration. Someone who knew how to work. Someone who'd stand next to him when the weather turned bad, and weather always turns bad eventually. He said he'd seen Seraphine in town. Hauling sacks. Fighting for fair prices. Holding her family together while everything around her tried to fall apart. He believed she was tougher than this whole valley gave her credit for. Then he added one more thing before he left. The choice was hers. He wasn't going to drag her anywhere. He put his hat back on and walked out into the night, leaving Seraphine staring at the closed door. For the next few days, the whole town of Miller's Gulch couldn't stop talking. Women whispered after church about the poor girl the mountain man wanted. Men at the store muttered that nobody rides down from the high country with an offer that generous unless he's hiding something. Seraphine heard every word while she counted coins twice at the general store, just to be sure. Callan came by most evenings, sitting on the porch rail as the sky turned that deep blue right before dark. He never once pushed her for an answer. Instead, he talked about the mountains. Deep snow. Clear rivers. Quiet valleys that nobody from town had ever laid eyes on. He talked about how fast the world was changing, railroads cutting through land that used to be untouched, big companies hungry for timber. And in a low voice, almost like he was talking to himself, he said a person could either let that change crush them, or learn to move with it. 2 days later, the men from the bank showed up. Clean horses. Neat coats. Flat, cold voices. They told her father exactly how much he owed and exactly what they'd take if he didn't pay soon, the claim, the cabin, even the mule. When they rode off, dust settled over the yard, and her father sank into his chair like his legs had simply given out. That night he told Seraphine that Callan's offer might be the only thing standing between her family and losing everything. Without it, the bank would take the cabin, and the kids could be split up and sent off to strangers. He said he was sorry his failures had landed on her shoulders. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold his coffee cup. Later, Seraphine climbed up to the loft and stood in front of the cracked mirror nailed to the wall. The woman looking back at her had tired eyes and a tight jaw. She wasn't a girl anymore, waiting around for life to be kind to her. She lay awake most of that night listening to the wind claw at the roof and her father's rough breathing below. And no matter which way she turned the problem over in her head, it always landed in the same place. At dawn, the mountain peaks turned a pale gold under a cold, thin sky. When she stepped out onto the porch, Callan was already there, standing beside a small wagon loaded with sacks and crates. 2 horses stamped their feet, breathing steam into the freezing air. Her brother and sister huddled in the doorway. Her father leaned against the frame, watching her, his shoulders bent low. Seraphine's heart was being pulled in 2 directions at once. Fear and duty tugged her back toward the house. But something thin and bright, something that felt almost like hope, pulled her toward the wagon and whatever was waiting beyond it. She walked down the steps and stood in front of Callan. His face was calm. He didn't smile, didn't look away. He just waited. She told him she'd go with him. As his wife. Callan nodded once, like he understood exactly what those words had cost her, and held out his hand. It was rough and warm. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and the wheels creaked as they pulled away from the only home she'd ever known, the cabin shrinking behind them until it was nothing but a dark shape against the sky. Ahead, a narrow trail climbed higher into the mountains. And as the town disappeared behind them, Seraphine couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was holding its breath. Like it knew something about Callan Hale that she didn't. For 2 full days, the trail kept climbing. The air got thinner, sharper, until every breath felt like work. Tall pines pressed in close on both sides, and gray cliffs rose up like walls. Callan handled the horses with an easy grip, saying very little, his eyes constantly scanning the sky and the rocks and the tree line. They stopped by a narrow creek to rest the horses. Callan built a fire in just a few quick, practiced moves, like his hands could do it without his brain even being involved. Seraphine sat on a flat rock, watching him. He looked like any patched-up mountain man doing his best to get by. But nothing about him was careless. Every knot he tied, every buckle he checked, was neat. Deliberate. That night, they slept under a canvas stretched between the wagon and a pine tree. The stars burned bright and cold above them. Seraphine lay awake listening to the horses shift and the fire slowly die down to coals. Doubt crept in, she'd tied her whole life to a man she barely knew. But then she pictured her father's cough. Her brother and sister curled up together on that narrow bed. And the doubt settled back down. She'd made this choice for them, and that choice still felt solid. On the 3rd morning, the land started to change. Thick pine forest thinned out into gray rock and pale aspen trees, their white trunks glowing against the slope. The wagon jolted over rough ground, and more than once Callan climbed down to steady a wheel or guide the horses around a sharp bend. Seraphine studied him as he worked. His coat was worn thin, but his boots were solid, well kept. He spoke to the horses in a low, steady voice, like someone who trained good animals his whole life. And every so often, when he stopped to look out over the ridges, his shoulders would square up in a way that didn't look like a man hunting for work. It looked like a man checking on something that already belonged to him. Late that afternoon, they reached a narrow pass between two stone walls. Callan pulled the horses to a stop and just sat there, reins in his hands, not moving, not talking. Seraphine asked if something was wrong. He said the roughest part of the trail was behind them. But the next hill was going to change everything. There was an edge in his voice she hadn't heard before, like a man bracing for something bigger than bad terrain. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward through the pass. The trail curved around a cluster of twisted pines, and then the whole world opened up in front of them. Below sat a wide, hidden valley, cupped between steep slopes and dark timber. A clear river cut straight through the middle of it, catching the last of the daylight. Even that close to winter, patches of green still showed in the meadow. It looked untouched. Quiet. Almost like a secret nobody had told her yet. And it wasn't empty. In the center of the valley stood a massive lodge, built from heavy logs and stone, with wide porches wrapping around every side. Tall windows caught the sunlight. Smoke curled up from more than one chimney. Barns and fences spread out in neat, organized lines. A long drive swept from the front door straight to where they were standing. This was not the home of a poor mountain man. Seraphine gripped the edge of the wagon seat as they started down the winding track toward it. Her heart was hammering. She'd agreed to marry a man who claimed to have almost nothing. But whoever lived in that lodge had more than half the wealthy families in Denver combined. She asked whose place it was. Callan's answer came quiet and even. The valley was called Silver Hollow. The lodge was Hollow House. It was his home. And now, he said, it was hers too. The words hit her harder than the cold wind. Before she could even respond, a tall man in clean work clothes stepped out onto the front steps and walked toward them with an easy, confident stride. He greeted Callan by name and said everything inside was ready for him. And right there, something in Callan shifted. His shoulders straightened. His chin lifted. A quiet authority settled over him that hadn't been there a minute ago. Same worn coat. But he no longer looked like a man asking for a place in the world. He looked like the man who owned it. Inside, warm lamplight glowed against wood-paneled walls. A massive stone fireplace roared at one end of the great room. Thick rugs covered polished floors, and paintings of mountains and forests hung between tall windows. The whole place smelled like cedar and fresh bread. Seraphine walked in slowly, almost afraid to touch anything. Her hands knew rough wood and chipped tin cups. Not carved railings and smooth porcelain. A woman in a neat apron brought over a tray with tea in thin white cups. Seraphine wrapped her fingers around one, almost too nervous to drink, worried it might shatter in her hands. When the room finally went quiet except for the crackle of the fire, Callan stood in front of her. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something new in his eyes. Not fear of the cliffs or the cold. Fear of losing something that actually mattered to him. He told her there were things he hadn't been honest about. Not to trick her, he said, but because he needed to know who she really was before handing her the full weight of his life. His real name wasn't just Callan Hale. It was Callan Ashworth Hale, heir to the Hale Timber Company, forests, mills, and this entire valley. When his father died, all of it landed on him. In Denver, people only ever saw the money. They flattered him, schemed around him, tried to marry their daughters into his fortune. He'd gotten sick of being treated like a prize instead of a person. So he'd gone up into the high country in rough clothes, looking for someone who could see past all of it. Seraphine stood there listening, heat rising in her cheeks. She'd married him out of duty, and because something about him felt steady and real. Now she was learning that steadiness came with more weight, more power, than she ever guessed. She didn't know whether to feel grateful her hard choice had led her here, or angry that he'd hidden so much of himself. She asked why he'd picked her, out of every woman he could have had. Callan said he'd watched her fight for fair prices at the trading post. Watched her protect her brother and sister from harsh words. Watched her face every hardship with her back straight and her chin up. He needed a wife who could stand beside him when other people tried to carve up his land and steer his life for their own gain. Then he told her something else. If, now that she knew the truth, she wanted to leave, he'd still pay off her father's debts. Still keep the cabin and the claim safe for her family. No conditions. Seraphine turned toward the fire and watched the flames move over the logs. She thought about her father's cough, her siblings' thin little arms, the garden she'd worked in rocky soil for years. She thought about this valley, and the man standing behind her without his mask on for the first time. Her heart ached. But underneath the ache was the same stubborn strength that had carried her through every hard year of her life. She turned to face him and told him she didn't need a rich man. She needed an honest one. And now that the truth was finally out in the open, she was staying. Whatever storms came for Silver Hollow, whether from the wild peaks outside or the polished streets of Denver, they'd face them together. The first days at Hollow House blurred together. Seraphine learned the winding paths of the lodge, the creak of every stairway, the way the whole valley seemed to hold a kind of quiet peace. The staff watched her carefully, unsure whether to treat her like a guest or the woman of the house. Callan kept his word. He walked the land with her, showed her the mill road, the workers' cabins, the small school he'd started for the children of his employees. He listened when she asked about wages and housing conditions. When she pointed out a drafty wall or a weak roof, he didn't wave her off. He wrote it down and told his foreman to fix it. For the first time, Seraphine let herself believe this strange new life might actually settle into something steady. Then one afternoon, a carriage came up the drive, too polished, too clean, not a speck of trail dust on it. Dark horses stamped against the packed earth. A woman stepped out in a deep blue traveling cloak, her hair pinned tight, her eyes sharp and gray as a winter sky. Callan stiffened beside Seraphine. He introduced the woman as his aunt, Vivian Hale. Two men in expensive city suits followed behind her, the kind of men who measured everything in profit and loss. Inside, Vivian looked Seraphine over from boots to hairline. Not rude exactly. Just cold. She called her a surprise, and asked if Callan had really gone and married without checking with the board first. The word board landed in the room like a slammed door. One of the suited men explained, in a smooth, careful voice, that Hale Timber was on the edge of something big, contracts, investors from back east, offers that could triple their money if they cleared more forest and cut new roads through the mountains. Vivian said, for something this important, Callan needed to present the right image. A proper marriage. A woman suited for Denver drawing rooms. Someone from a respected family, not, and here she looked directly at Seraphine, a mountain girl with dirt still under her nails. The word stung, but Seraphine kept her chin up. Callan stepped closer to her side and said plainly that Seraphine was his wife, and his choice, and that wasn't up for negotiation. Vivian's smile didn't move past her mouth. She said choices have consequences, and the board wasn't going to risk the company's future over a marriage made in the backwoods. That night, Seraphine lay in a bed far too soft and grand for sleep. Through the window, the valley glowed silver under the moonlight, calm and still. But inside the walls of Hollow House, something ugly was quietly taking shape. The next morning, she heard raised voices behind a half-open door. Vivian's voice cut sharp through the hallway, calling Seraphine unsuitable, untrained, a weight that would drag Callan down in Denver society. She warned that investors would walk if he kept clinging to a woman with no name and no money. Callan's voice came back rough with anger. He said he wasn't trading his wife for contracts. He wasn't a piece to be moved around a board for someone else's profit. Vivian told him he was being naive. Said sentiment made men weak, and weakness ruined empires. Seraphine could have slipped away quietly. Instead, she stepped into the doorway and announced herself. Both of them turned, startled. Her hands were shaking, but her voice stayed steady as she said that if they were going to weigh her worth like a bolt of cloth, she had every right to stand on the scale herself. Vivian's eyebrows lifted, mildly surprised. She said this was business. If Seraphine really cared about Callan, she'd step aside and let him secure the company's future. Seraphine looked her dead in the eye and said what Callan needed wasn't a perfect hostess. He needed someone who'd stand beside him when people tried to tear his home apart. The room went completely still. Callan looked at Seraphine like he was seeing her for the first time all over again. Vivian's eyes cooled even further. She said there was one simple way to find out whether Seraphine could actually handle Callan's world. The governor's reception in Denver, 1 week away. Every powerful person in the territory would be there. If Seraphine could walk into that room, hold her head high, and not fall apart under all that judgment, Vivian said she'd at least be willing to listen. It wasn't a kind offer. It was a test built to break her. After Vivian left, the anger on Callan's face melted into worry. He told Seraphine she didn't have to go through with it. He'd fight his aunt and the board without dragging her into Denver's games. Seraphine looked down at her rough, work-worn hands, then out toward the mountains. She said the fight had already found her. Vivian had already dragged her name through every parlor and meeting room she could reach. Running wouldn't undo that. Better to walk into the light and let them see her clearly than hide in the shadows while they picked her apart in whispers. Callan realized there was no talking her out of it. He promised that whatever waited for them in Denver, they'd face it side by side. They spent the next several days preparing. A seamstress came up from town and spent long hours cutting and stitching a gown, forest green, simple lines, something that let Seraphine actually breathe and move. The staff coached her through formal dinners and basic dance steps. She practiced walking in new shoes down the long hallway, learning to glide instead of trip on the hem. Callan stayed up late most nights studying contracts and board records, working out exactly how much power his aunt really had. When they finally climbed into the coach headed for Denver, the valley disappeared behind them under a clear, cold sky. Seraphine watched Hollow House shrink against the mountains and quietly promised herself she'd come back stronger than she left. The road wound down from stone and pine into rolling hills, then fenced pastures, then crowded towns. Chimney smoke thickened the air. Telegraph lines followed alongside the road like thin black ribs holding up the sky. By the time the city came into view, Seraphine felt like she'd crossed into another country entirely. Denver was loud. Crowded. Wagons and riders packed the streets, brick buildings leaned in over the sidewalks, and people moved past in coats and hats of every possible style. The coach pulled up outside a grand hotel with tall windows and a carved stone entrance, gas lights burning even though it was still daylight. Inside, the smell of perfume and polished wood settled around her. Men in sharp suits talked business in low, serious tones. Women moved through the room in bright silk, their voices quick and light. For one heartbeat, Seraphine felt impossibly small, a mountain girl dropped into a world that clearly didn't want her. Then Callan's hand closed around hers. He reminded her she'd survived hunger, blizzards, and men with cold, calculating eyes long before she ever laid eyes on a chandelier. These people in this room had never once heard a wolf cry across open snow. They'd never stood between a storm and the people they loved. She had nothing to fear from a room full of people who'd never had to be as brave as she already was. As evening fell, they stood outside the ballroom doors. Music slipped through the gap, and staff moved in and out carrying trays that caught the light. A man at the entrance waited to announce their names. Vivian was already inside, no doubt turning heads and planting stories with every polite smile. Seraphine took a full breath, lifted her chin, and gave the doorman a small nod. The doors opened, and light from the chandeliers spilled out over the polished floor. The announcer called Callan's name, and "Hail Timber" rolled across the room like a drumbeat. Heads turned toward the man in the plain black coat and the young woman beside him in a green dress the color of pine after rain. For one heartbeat, Seraphine wanted to turn around and walk straight back out. The air smelled like perfume and roasted meat. Diamonds and gold caught the light everywhere she looked. Nobody in this room knew about thin gardens or cracked dishes or wind that cut through every coat you owned. They knew ledgers, railroads, and power. Her heart pounded, but she kept her shoulders straight and stepped forward on Callan's arm. Men in fitted dark suits swarmed toward Callan almost immediately, shaking his hand, using his first name like old friends. Their eyes slid over Seraphine, quick and dismissive, sizing her up and moving past her. She felt every look like a hand on her skin, but she didn't flinch. If she could survive blizzards and hunger, she could survive a room full of polite dismissal. Vivian appeared out of the crowd, wrapped in deep red silk. She greeted Callan warmly, then let her eyes travel slowly over Seraphine from boots to hair. In a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, she said a mountain girl could be made almost presentable with enough effort. A few nearby women smirked behind their fans, waiting for Seraphine to crumble. Seraphine thanked her for sending the seamstress and said she personally cared more about strong stitching than fancy ruffles. The words were simple, but they didn't bend an inch. A couple of the men nearby hid quiet smiles. The corner of Vivian's mouth tightened. The blow she'd planned hadn't landed the way she wanted. Vivian brought over a tall investor with silver hair and polished manners, a man deeply invested in a company chasing heavy logging rights in the Hale forests. He talked about progress and jobs and fortunes waiting in the high country. Then he turned to Seraphine with a smile that never reached his eyes and asked if someone from such a tiny settlement could really understand plans of that scale. Seraphine thought about hillsides stripped bare, brown floodwater, and cabins buried under landslides. In a calm, steady voice, she said she understood exactly what happens when too many trees come down too fast, springs turning to mud, roads washing out, families paying the price when storms hit stripped land. She didn't raise her voice once. She just laid out exactly what she'd seen with her own eyes. The small circle around them went quiet. The investor's smile thinned out. Into that silence came another voice, warm, confident, unhurried. The governor himself had drifted close enough to listen. He greeted Callan, then took Seraphine's hand with real respect and said the territory needed people who understood the high country the way she clearly did. He asked her to keep talking. They spoke for several minutes while more people gathered around to listen. Seraphine talked about fair wages, safer camps, and cutting timber in a way that left enough forest standing for the next generation to inherit something worth having. The governor nodded along, agreeing more than once. Slowly, the entire feel of the room started shifting toward her. Men who'd ignored her 20 minutes earlier were suddenly listening closely. Vivian watched from the edge of the circle, her face going cold and hard. She slipped away toward a cluster of serious-looking men near the wall. When she came back, an older judge walked beside her, carrying a worn leather folder. Vivian's smile turned sharp and bright. She announced that the judge had reviewed the family's legal documents and found a serious problem with Callan's marriage, one the board couldn't ignore. The judge opened the folder and explained that Callan's inheritance came with strict conditions. Any marriage that threatened the company's stability could be legally challenged. Certain approvals hadn't been properly filed. In his opinion, the marriage didn't fully satisfy the terms of the will. Nearby guests went silent, leaning in, hungry for scandal, waiting to watch Seraphine fall apart. The words hit her like cold water. But they didn't knock her down. She asked to see the paper herself. The judge, a little surprised, handed it over. Seraphine read every line slowly, the same way she used to read claim notices by lantern light back home. Her finger traced the cramped handwriting until she found exactly what she needed. The clause didn't only talk about risk. It also said a marriage could be defended if it strengthened the company's standing through public service to the territory and its people. She asked the judge to confirm that part. He did, a little less confident now, his voice not nearly as loud as before. Seraphine turned to the governor and asked whether speaking up for mountain families and advising on fair timber practices would count as public service in his eyes. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. He said he'd already been considering creating exactly that kind of role, and her words tonight had settled it for him. Right there, in front of the whole room, he asked Seraphine to accept an unpaid appointment as an advisor on high country affairs. A secretary stepped forward with a short letter carrying the territorial seal. Seraphine's hand trembled just once as she signed her name in careful, steady strokes. The judge cleared his throat and admitted that this new appointment removed any legal question the board could possibly raise. Whispers moved through the crowd. Vivian's face went pale, then stiff. The blade she'd sharpened for months had just turned back in her own hand. Callan stepped to Seraphine's side, thanked the officials with a few measured words, and told his aunt in a low, steady voice that his marriage was no longer hers to touch. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. For a second, it looked like she might argue. But there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make her look small in front of the governor, the judge, and half the powerful men in the territory. She turned and disappeared back into the crowd alone, red silk trailing behind her like a flag in retreat. Later, out on the hotel balcony, the city lights below looked like scattered embers in the dark. The air was sharp and clean. Seraphine felt the full weight of the night settle into her shoulders, exhausted, but standing. Callan told her he'd thought he was bringing her into his world. Instead, he'd watched her walk straight into it and refused to bend. Seraphine admitted she'd been scared the entire time, and did it anyway, because some things are worth being scared for. A few days later, they rode back to Silver Hollow. When the hidden valley opened up beneath them and Hollow House came into view, it looked the same, but somehow completely different. It wasn't just Callan's private hideaway anymore. It was something they'd built together. Changes started rolling in one after another. Worker cabins got rebuilt stronger. A small schoolhouse opened near the mill road. A camp doctor was hired so a winter cold didn't have the chance to turn into a tragedy. At board meetings, Callan pushed hard for better practices. When officials rode up from the city to inspect the operation, Seraphine met them on the porch herself and walked them through the timber operation personally. Trees still came down, sure. But new ones went into the ground too. Crews learned to leave the strong stand standing on the slopes instead of stripping them bare. The company still made money. It just made it on land that could still breathe. Vivian never tried to undo the marriage again. Time wore down her plans, and word eventually drifted up that some of her city schemes had quietly fallen apart. Life at Silver Hollow moved on without her. Children's laughter started filling the halls of Hollow House. The fire in the great room burned warm through the winter nights while Callan and Seraphine sat side by side, planning next season instead of bracing for the next disaster. Sometimes, when the wind rushed through the pines, Seraphine would stand out on the wide front porch and just listen. She'd remember the thin garden behind her father's failing cabin. The rough wagon ride up the narrow trail. The first stunned look at Hollow House hidden in that valley. The bright ballroom where people tried to put a price on her, and she refused to hand them the scale. She'd married a man she believed was a poor drifter from the mountains, and found a partner carrying an entire hidden kingdom in the wild. He hadn't chosen her as some kind of rescue. He'd chosen her as an equal. Together, they'd turned a secret lodge into a real home, and a hard, cutthroat business into something that could finally stand in the light.